Close your eyes for a moment. I want you to come somewhere with me. Somewhere the ground itself remembers what happened on it. Somewhere the red Mississippi clay has held on to a shape for 175 years and has not, in all that time, quite forgotten. It is a Sunday morning in the spring of 1849. The place is a cotton plantation about 9 miles east of Natchez in Adams County, Mississippi, in the rolling country above the great brown coil of the river. The sky is the color of a washed dish. The dogwoods are in flower along the edge of the canebrake. A single mockingbird is doing 3 imitations of 3 other birds in the crown of a hickory tree. And somewhere behind the main house, a mule is coughing in its stall. And in the small clearing behind the smokehouse, a clearing you would not notice if you did not know to look for it, hidden by a stand of pine, 22 paces from the back porch of the plantation's overseer's cabin, a woman is standing in a shallow pit with a shovel in her hands. The pit is not very deep yet. It is, on this particular Sunday morning, about knee-high on her. She has been at it in the pale gray light of the early morning for perhaps an hour. She is 31 years old. She is tall, with the long, straight back of a woman who has done field work her whole life. She is wearing a plain gray dress that has been washed so many times it is nearly the color of the sky above her. Her hair is wrapped in a length of blue cloth. Her hands, on the wooden handle of the shovel, are steady. You can see her face if you look. It is not the face you would expect. It is not afraid. It is not weeping. It is the face of a woman who has been doing exactly this thing on exactly this morning for a very long time, and who has decided, in the small, private country inside her own skull, that she is not going to give the man watching her from the porch of the overseer's cabin the one thing he is standing there to collect. She is not going to break. Her name is Cora Bell. She is 31 years old, and she has been enslaved on this plantation for all 31 of them. She was born in a cabin 200 yards from where she is standing right now. She has never, in her whole life, been more than 11 miles from this piece of ground. She cannot read. She cannot write. She has no last name that any court in the state of Mississippi would recognize. And every Sunday morning, for the past 2 years and 4 months, she has been forced, at gunpoint by the man watching her from the porch, to walk out to this clearing and to pick up this shovel and to dig this pit a little deeper than it was the Sunday before. Because on this plantation, in the spring of 1849, in the private amusement of the man who owns it, Cora Bell is being made to dig her own grave. One Sunday at a time. And I want you to hold on to something, because it is the reason we are sitting in the dark with her tonight. Before I say anything else about the man on the porch, or about what he did, or about the terrible 3 years that were sitting between the woman in the pit and the freedom she did not yet know was coming for her, I want to ask you something. Where are you listening to this from tonight? Drop it in the comments below. Tell me what city, what country, what time it is where you are right now as you are sitting with this woman on a Sunday morning in 1849. Because in a moment, we are going to walk together, you and me and her, through one of the strangest and cruelest and most quietly extraordinary stories the state of Mississippi has ever tried to bury. And I want to know who is walking beside her tonight. Now let me tell you what you are looking at. The man on the porch of the overseer's cabin is not the overseer. The overseer at this plantation is a Cajun named Jean Bourdelon. and Jean Bordelon is, at this moment, 300 yards away in the main house, taking coffee with the housekeeper, because it is Sunday morning and the fields are quiet. The man on the porch is the owner of the plantation himself. He is a man named William Fenwick. He is 48 years old. He is wearing a dark linen suit and a wide-brimmed straw hat and holding, across his lap, a shotgun he has not needed to raise in 28 months, because the woman in the pit has never, in 28 months, given him a reason to raise it. William Fenwick inherited this plantation from his father in 1837. He owns, by the tax records of Adams County, 94 enslaved people. He is a member of the Adams County Agricultural Society. He sits on the vestry of Trinity Episcopal Church in Natchez. He is, in the eyes of the white county he lives in, a normal man. A well-tailored man. A man who would be greatly offended if you called him a monster to his face. Because, in the strange, careful language of the Natchez slaveholding class in 1849, the things William Fenwick did to the woman in the pit did not qualify as monstrous. They qualified, in his own private vocabulary, as a discipline. He is, at this moment, watching her dig. He has been coming out here every Sunday morning at first light for 2 years and 4 months. He does not, most Sundays, say anything to her. He simply sits on the porch of the overseer's empty cabin with the shotgun across his lap and watches her work. She digs for 2 hours. He watches for 2 hours. And then, at 9 o'clock exactly, because on this plantation everything happens on the clock, he raises the shotgun and cocks the hammer with a small, dry click that carries across the clearing. And Cora Bell steps out of the pit and lays the shovel down beside it and walks back through the pines to the slave cabins. And William Fenwick goes back to the main house to have his breakfast and read his Bible before the family goes into Natchez to church. That is the shape of it. That has been the shape of it since the 4th Sunday of December in the year of our Lord 1846. And I want you to remember this, because it is the reason this story exists to be told at all. That woman standing in the pit on the Sunday morning I have just described to you, that woman, 31 years old, in a dress the color of the sky, with steady hands on the shovel and a face that will not break, is going to walk out of this plantation. She does not know it yet. William Fenwick, on the porch, does not know it yet. But before another 2 years have passed, she will be gone from this piece of red clay forever. And before another 5 years have passed, William Fenwick himself will be dead. And the manner of his death and the person who caused it will be the small, dark secret that a certain very small circle of people in Natchez will carry to their graves without ever saying it out loud. She will live to be 101 years old. She will die in a small wooden house in Cass County, Michigan, in the winter of 1919, with 3 grandchildren at her bedside and a photograph of her mother, a photograph she commissioned in Detroit in 1892, from the description she carried in her head for 53 years, hanging on the wall above her bed. And in her final week, in a small, careful voice she had been saving, she will tell the whole thing. That is the story we are going to sit with tonight. Her name was Cora Bell. She was 31 years old, and she was digging her own grave in a clearing outside Natchez, one Sunday morning at a time. And this is how she outlived him. She was born in the spring of 1818 in a slave cabin on the Fenwick place in what was then still called the Mississippi Territory, 3 years before Mississippi was formally admitted as the 20th state of the Union. Her mother was a woman named Judith. Judith was tall and thin and quiet, with the kind of face that looked, even when she was young, as though it had already decided which arguments in life were worth having and which were not. She had been brought to the Fenwick place around the year 1810 as part of the wave of enslaved people that the elder Fenwick, William's father, a man named Thomas, had purchased in Virginia and marched south to work the new cotton lands opening up along the lower Mississippi. Judith had been 14 years old when she made that walk. She had been walked in a coffle of 37 people from a plantation in Halifax County, Virginia, down through the Cumberland Gap, across the Tennessee River, through the Chickasaw Nation, and into the Natchez District, over a journey of 11 weeks. She had arrived at the Fenwick place in the summer of 1810, and she had not left it in the 39 years that followed. Cora Bell's father was a man named Isaac. He was, by every account that Judith later gave her daughter, a good man. Not a large man, not a strong man, but a patient one, a careful one. A man who had grown up in the same Halifax County plantation and had been walked south in the same coffle, and had understood from the first week he laid eyes on Judith that she was the person he was going to spend the rest of his life alongside. They did not marry in any way the state of Mississippi would have recognized. Enslaved marriages had no legal standing in that state, or in any of the slave states of the American South, in the whole 70-year history of the country's peculiar institution. But they took each other's hands in the door of the small cabin Thomas Fenwick had given them in the fall of 1817, and they told the small handful of witnesses gathered around them that they were, from that night forward, a household. And a household they were for the next 11 years. Cora Bell was born the spring after they took each other's hands. She was their first and only child. I want you to sit with the smallness of her first 10 years, because it matters for everything that came after. The Fenwick place in the 1820s was not a large plantation by the eventual standards of Mississippi cotton wealth. Thomas Fenwick owned, in that decade, around 40 enslaved people. He worked a middle-sized tract of cleared land, produced a middling crop, and lived, with his wife and 2 sons, in a plain 2-story white frame house that would have looked to a Charleston or a New Orleans visitor more like a well-off farmer's home than a great planter's mansion. He was not a cruel man in the way that some men in that country were cruel. He did not beat his enslaved people for sport. He did not, in his lifetime, break up families for cash. He was, in the ugly and imperfect vocabulary of the era, one of the men that other white men called a decent master, which meant only that he did not do the very worst of the things a man of his class and position was legally permitted to do. Cora Bell grew up in those first 10 years in the small, careful daylight of that decency. She grew up with a mother and a father who loved her. She grew up in a cabin that had, in one corner, a small wooden shelf on which Isaac had carved with a knife the letter C, the first letter of her name, which he could recognize even though he could not read anything else, because Judith had shown him what the letter looked like, and he had wanted it to be on the shelf where his daughter slept. She grew up learning from the small enslaved community around her the same things every enslaved child in the American South learned in those years: how to move quietly around white people, how to answer without volunteering, how to stand still when standing still was the safest thing she could do. And she grew up learning, in particular, from an old woman named Aunt Zilpa, the plantation's midwife and healer, a woman who had come to the Fenwick place from South Carolina in the 1790s and who was, by the 1820s, close to 80 years old. The names of the plants of the Mississippi country: snakeroot and pennyroyal and mullein, cottonwood bark and willow leaf, and the roots of the pokeweed that had to be dug in the second year to be safe. Aunt Zilpa taught these things to Cora Belle from the time Cora Belle could walk beside her along the edge of the cane brake with a small basket. And she taught them for the same reason that old women in that country had taught them to small girls for 150 years. Because the day was going to come when there would be no doctor and no help, and only what Cora Belle carried in her own head. That first 10 years ended in the summer of 1828. There was a fever that summer along the lower Mississippi. It came up out of the swamps in July, and it moved through the plantations like a slow, patient hand. And by the time it had run its course in early September, it had killed something like a third of the enslaved population of Adams County, and about a fifth of the white population. And it had killed, in the small cabin with the letter C carved on the shelf in the corner, both Judith and Isaac within 11 days of each other. I want to stop for a moment on that summer, because it is where the shape of Cora Belle's life first cracked. She was 10 years old. She sat by her mother's bed for the last 3 days of Judith's life, and she sat by her father's bed for the last 5 days of Isaac's. And Aunt Zilpa, herself half dead from the same fever, but the only one of them who survived it, did what she could with the plants, and it was not enough for either of them. Cora Belle buried both of her parents, at the age of 10, in the small enslaved burying ground at the northeast corner of the Fenwick property. She did not, at that age, have the words for what she was doing. But she remembered, 60 and 70 years later, that on the second afternoon after her father was buried, she went back to the burying ground alone with a small piece of broken slate she had found in the yard behind the smokehouse. And she scratched, in the red clay above her father's grave, the letter C. Not because it was his letter, because it was the only letter she knew how to make, and she wanted him to know, wherever he was, that she had been there. Then Thomas Fenwick, in the winter of 1837, died too. Not of a fever, of an ordinary heart attack at the dinner table at the age of 61. And the Fenwick place passed to his older son, William. William Fenwick, in the winter of 1837, was 36 years old. He had spent the previous decade being groomed to inherit, sent to South Carolina College and Columbia, sent to Philadelphia for a year of what his father called finishing, sent to England in 1832 for a grand tour that ended, according to the private letters that survive from that trip, in a small, unspecified scandal in London that his father had to send money to resolve. He was, by every account of the people who knew him best, a man of two very distinct sides. In public, at Trinity Episcopal Church, at the Agricultural Society dinners, at the balls the Natchez gentry held in the great houses along Second Creek, he was a courteous, well-mannered, mildly humorous host, a man who danced adequately and drank moderately and quoted the Latin poets in a way that his neighbors found impressive without being showy. In private, inside the walls of his own plantation, out of the sight of any white peer, he was a different creature entirely. He drank alone. He kept, in a locked cabinet in his study, a small collection of instruments whose purpose the household servants understood without ever having been told. And he had, over the 11 years between his inheritance and the spring morning I described to you at the beginning of this story, developed a very particular and very private habit of using the enslaved people on his plantation for the small, dark theater of his own boredom. The other planters of Adams County knew, in the vague way such things were known, that William Fenwick was harsh with his people. They did not, most of them, know the specifics. And what specifics they did know, a rumor about a young man sold south in 1841 with unexplained scars, a rumor about a woman found drowned in the mill pond in 1844 with her hands still tied behind her back. They did not repeat outside their own dining rooms, because that too was one of the private rules of the Natchez gentry in the 1840s. What another man did inside his own plantation gates was, in the strict letter of the class code they lived by, that man's own business. By the mid-1840s, Cora Bell was in her late 20s. She had grown by then into a tall, thin woman with her mother's face and her father's patience. She worked in the cotton fields during the pick and in the cornfields during the summer, and on the rainy days when field work was impossible, in the small candle and soap house at the back of the plantation where the household's tallow was rendered. She was, in the accounting of William Fenwick, a good worker, steady, capable, not sickly, not troublesome. She had, at that point, no husband. Aunt Zilpa, the old woman who had taught her the plants when she was small, had died in 1841 at the age of 93, and Cora Bell had inherited from her, in the small, unofficial way such things were inherited, the position of the plantation's herbal woman. She was the one people came to when a child was fevered or a wound had gone bad. She kept a small drying room in the back of her own cabin, with bunches of pennyroyal and snake root and mullein hanging from the rafters. And she was the one, in the fall of 1846, whom a young enslaved woman on the plantation named Delphia, a woman of 19, who had been at the Fenwick place for 4 years, who was married to a field hand named Reuben, came to in the middle of the night with the small, terrible whispered problem that nobody in the enslaved community of the Fenwick place could resolve without her. Delphia was pregnant. Delphia was pregnant, and the child was not Reuben's. The child was William Fenwick's. You are listening tonight, and I want you to sit for a moment with what that meant. In the summer of 1846, William Fenwick had, in the specific, ugly, private way that white slaveholders in that era exercised the powers they claimed over the women they owned, begun what he would have called, if he ever spoke of it aloud, an arrangement with the young woman Delphia. He had, over the course of 3 months, forced her 3 or 4 or 6 times in the small overseer's cabin at the edge of the clearing behind the smokehouse. He had not, of course, asked her. He had not asked her husband, either. He had, in the small, dark language of the plantation, simply taken what the law of the state of Mississippi in 1846 had told him he had the right to take. And Delphia was now pregnant. She could not bring this child to term. If the child was born with William Fenwick's features on it, as everyone in the household and everyone in the quarters understood that it was very likely to be born with, Delphia's life was going to be a form of dying too slow to have a name. Reuben's life was going to be worse. And the child itself, when it was born, was going to be raised in a household that would treat it as evidence of a crime that no one was permitted to name out loud until such time as William Fenwick, as he had done quietly with 2 other such children in the previous decade, sold it south at the age of 4 or 5 to a Louisiana buyer, and the whole matter was made to disappear. Delphia did not want any of that. Delphia came in the middle of a rainy October night in 1846 to Cora Bell's cabin, and she asked Cora Bell for the plants. Cora Bell knew the plants. Aunt Zilpa had taught her, in the last year of the old woman's life, the specific combinations that a woman in Delphia's position could take. Pennyroyal, in a particular concentration, brewed in a particular way, taken over a particular number of days. She could have refused. If she had refused, no one in the world would have blamed her, because helping a young woman in that condition, on that plantation, in that year, was one of the most dangerous things an enslaved herbal woman in the state of Mississippi could do. If Fenwick found out, if any of the field drivers found out, If the wrong overseer's boy carried the wrong piece of gossip to the main house, the woman who had prepared the herbs was going to pay for it in ways the enslaved community of Adams County had 150 years of experience imagining. Cora Belle did not refuse. She prepared the herbs. She sent them in a small clay jar with Delphia in the dark of the same rainy October night. Delphia took them over the next 6 days in the small pot of tea she carried with her to the fields. On the 7th day, in the pre-dawn hour, Delphia lost the pregnancy in the privy behind the enslaved women's cabins, and she buried what she had lost in a small hole she dug herself with a piece of broken hoe. And by sunrise, she was back in the fields. For 6 weeks, nothing happened. Delphia and Reuben went on with their small, careful lives. Cora Belle went on with hers. And then, in the 2nd week of December 1846, one of the plantation's house servants, a woman named Miriam, who worked in the kitchen of the main house and who had, since the summer, been quietly currying favor with the mistress of the house, Anne Fenwick, brought a small piece of information into the main kitchen. She had noticed, she said in a low voice while helping Anne with the household accounts, that the herbal woman down in the quarters, Cora Belle, had been seen carrying jars in and out of Delphia's cabin in October. And she had noticed, she said, that Delphia had been sick for the better part of a week in the middle of October. And she thought, this was the sentence that finished it, that the mistress ought to know. Anne Fenwick told her husband that night at dinner. William Fenwick, who had, of course, known perfectly well what he had done to Delphia in the summer, and who had been waiting with the small, mean patience of a man who was interested in the outcome to see whether a child would appear, understood immediately what Miriam's report meant. He did not confront Delphia. He did not confront Reuben. And he did not, this is important, this is the small dark hinge of what came next, sell Cora Belle, which would have been the ordinary punishment on an ordinary plantation. He did not send her south to New Orleans. He did not put her on the block. He decided, instead, to do something no other planter in Adams County had ever done, because no other planter in Adams County had the particular private appetite that William Fenwick had spent 48 years developing. He decided to make a discipline out of her. He decided that Cora Belle, for the crime of interfering with what he considered his private property in Delphia's body, was going to be made to spend the rest of her useful life understanding, in a small, careful, weekly ceremony, exactly what the man who owned her was capable of making her do. He called Jean Bourdelon into his study on the 2nd Saturday of December, 1846. He told the overseer what he wanted done. He instructed Bourdelon that on the following morning, the 4th Sunday of December, 1846, Cora Belle was to be taken from her cabin at first light, walked to the small clearing behind the smokehouse, given a shovel, and told to begin digging a pit at a location William Fenwick had already marked with a stake. She was to be told that the pit was her grave. She was to be told that she would dig it one Sunday morning at a time for as long as William Fenwick required her to. And she was to be told that on the Sunday William Fenwick decided the pit was deep enough, a Sunday whose date he refused to specify but which he assured her would come, she would be shot in the pit and buried in it, and the entire matter of Delphia and the penny royal would be closed. The overseer Bourdelon, who was not a squeamish man but who did have some limits, said quietly that this was, in his own private opinion, a discipline that no other planter in the county was going to understand. William Fenwick told him that no other planter in the county needed to know. And on the 4th Sunday of December, 1846, at the first gray light of the morning, Cora Belle was walked from her cabin to the small clearing behind the smokehouse, and she was given a shovel, and she was told what the shovel was for. She dug for 2 hours that first morning. She did not weep. She did not beg. She dug, because the alternative in that moment was to be shot on the ground beside a shovel she had refused to lift. And Cora Bell was 28 years old, and she had already decided in the small, private country inside her own skull that she was not going to give William Fenwick the ceremony he was standing on the porch to receive. That was the first Sunday. There would be 122 more. Let me stay with you for a moment on the shape of those Sundays, because you have to feel it before we go any further. Every Sunday morning at first light, Jean Bordelon, or one of his sub-overseers, would come to Cora Bell's cabin, and he would tap on the door twice, and Cora Bell would rise, and she would put on her plain gray dress, and she would wrap her hair in the length of blue cloth, and she would walk out of the cabin without speaking. The other enslaved people in the quarters, who all knew by the end of the first month exactly what was happening in the clearing behind the smokehouse, would not look at her as she walked past. It was not that they did not care. It was that Cora Bell had, in a small conversation with 3 of the oldest women on the first Sunday she came back from the pit, asked them to please not make a show of it. Because the moment they made a show of it, William Fenwick would have won a piece of her that she was not willing to let him have. She would walk out and walk back, she said, in the same way she walked to the fields on any other morning. She would not have farewells. She would not have looks. She would carry it, she said, on her own back. They granted her that. She walked the 240 paces from her cabin to the clearing. She walked past the smokehouse. She walked through the small gap in the pines. She entered the clearing. She saw William Fenwick on the porch of the empty overseer's cabin with the shotgun across his lap. She did not greet him. She did not look at him. She walked to the pit, which, on the first Sunday, was only a stake in the ground with a small square marked around it in flour, and she picked up the shovel from where Bordelon had leaned it against a pine, and she began to dig. She dug for 2 hours. She did not stop for water. She did not stop for rest. William Fenwick did not offer either. He sat on the porch, and he watched her. And once every 15 or 20 minutes he would take out his pocket watch and check the time. And once, on the second Sunday of the first month, when Cora Bell stopped digging for perhaps 30 seconds to wipe the sweat out of her eyes, he raised the shotgun a fraction of an inch off his lap. Not to fire, just to remind her that he could. She did not stop to wipe her eyes again. At 9 o'clock on the dot, he cocked the hammer with the small, dry click that carried across the clearing, and Cora Bell stepped out of the pit and laid the shovel down beside it and walked back through the pines to her cabin. That was the shape of the first Sunday. That was the shape of the second Sunday. That was the shape, in the small, terrible arithmetic of it, of the next 122 Sundays of her life. The pit grew. On the first Sunday, in December of 1846, she dug it to a depth of maybe 8 inches. By the fourth Sunday, it was knee-deep at the shallow end. By the 10th Sunday, in the middle of February 1847, she was standing in it up to mid-thigh. By the 20th Sunday, the end of April, she had to bend to get the shovel down to the bottom of it. By the 30th Sunday, the beginning of July 1847, the pit was chest deep, and she was pulling the dirt up in stages, first onto a small platform of packed earth she had built at one end, then over the lip of the pit and into the growing pile beside it. By the end of the first year, the 52nd Sunday, The pit was, by any honest measurement, deep enough to bury her in. It was, in Bourdillon's own private notebook, which survives today in a private collection in Natchez, 6 feet 3 inches deep at the deepest point, and 7 feet 2 inches long and 31 inches wide. It was, in short, a grave. A full, finished, standard-sized 19th century grave. And William Fenwick, on the 52nd Sunday morning, sat on the porch of the empty overseer's cabin with the shotgun across his lap, and he watched her stand in that finished grave. And he did not shoot her. He said instead, at the end of the 2 hours when she was climbing out, the first sentence he had spoken to her out in the clearing in the entire 52 Sundays. "Deeper next week, Cora Belle." That was the first hinge. That was the small moment when Cora Belle understood, in the private country inside her skull, exactly what William Fenwick had been doing. He had not, in fact, ever intended to shoot her. He had not intended in the 4th Sunday of December 1846, when he set up the whole small, dark theater, to actually kill her at the end of it. If he had intended to kill her, he would have done it in the first week. He was a man who understood better than most that a slave who could not work was a slave who cost him money. And Cora Belle, in her cabin on Sunday afternoons, was as productive as any woman on the place through the rest of the week. What he had intended, what he was on that 52nd Sunday revealing to her by saying, "Deeper next week," was to make the ceremony itself the punishment. To make the digging of the grave the thing. To make her come out to the clearing every Sunday for the rest of his life, or the rest of hers, and go through the small, terrible motions of preparing her own death, on the private theory that the anticipation of the shot he was not going to fire would, week after week, month after month, year after year, do to her interior something more terrible than the shot itself would ever do. To break, in the ugly, private vocabulary of his own head, not her body, because he needed her body in the fields, but the small, stubborn thing in her that had made her prepare the penny-royal for Delphia. He wanted her, in short, to become a woman who trembled in the cabin on Saturday nights. He wanted her on Sunday mornings to weep as she walked the 240 paces to the clearing. He wanted her in the pit to beg. He wanted her on the porch of her cabin on Sunday afternoons to lie awake in the dark and hear the click of a shotgun hammer in her sleep. He wanted her, in the end, to break. Not once in a single afternoon, but slowly, week by week, in a slow, patient theater that no other planter in the county would ever know about, and that would confirm to him, in the small, dark room in the back of his own mind, exactly the thing he most needed to have confirmed, which was that the woman in the pit, and every other person in the quarters, and every other person he had ever owned in his life, was his to break, on any schedule he chose. That was the plan. But Cora Belle, and this was the second hinge, the one William Fenwick did not know about, the one he would not know about for another 2 years. Cora Belle was not breaking. She was, in fact, doing something else entirely. I want you to hold on tightly, because what I am about to tell you is the strangest and most important thing in the whole story. And it is the piece that no one in Adams County, not William Fenwick, not Jean Bourdillon, not Anne Fenwick, not the housekeeper, Miriam, not any of the other enslaved people on the plantation, understood was happening in the 2 years and 4 months between the 52nd Sunday and the morning I described to you at the beginning of this story. Every Sunday, in the pit, while William Fenwick sat on the porch and watched her work, Cora Belle was doing 2 things. The first thing was the thing he could see. She was digging. The second thing was the thing he could not see, and it was the thing that saved her life. But before I tell you what that second thing was, before I tell you what a 31-year-old enslaved woman with a shovel in a shallow pit was actually doing on those Sunday mornings in the small private country of her own body and her own mind, I want you to do one small thing. I want you to tell me your name. Drop it in the comments below, just your first name. Because the woman in the pit had a name, and it was Cora Bell. And William Fenwick on the porch did not say it, not once, in 122 Sundays. And I would like, before we go any further together, to know the name of the person who is sitting beside her tonight. Say it, and then come with me. Because the thing she was doing in that pit, the second thing, the invisible thing, the thing that turned a shovel and a shallow pit in a clearing behind a smokehouse into the slowest, patientest, quietest act of resistance any woman in that country ever put into practice, is the part of this story that no one has ever told before. And it is the part I want to tell you now. Come closer. I want you to look at the pit again. Look at it on the 10th Sunday in February of 1847, when it was still only knee-deep. Look at the walls of it. Look at the way the red Mississippi clay is packed in horizontal layers from the topsoil at the surface all the way down through the paler subsoil to the darker clay beneath. And look, if you can see it, at what Cora Bell is doing with her shovel. She is not digging straight down. She is digging in a very particular pattern. She is cutting the walls of the pit at a very specific, very deliberate angle. She is leaving, at the north end of the pit, a small step of earth that Bordelon's notebook, the notebook I mentioned to you earlier, the one in the private collection in Natchez, will later describe, in a puzzled aside, as an unnecessary shelf. And she is cutting into the west wall of the pit, about 20 inches below the surface, a small horizontal groove, only 3 or 4 inches deep, that from the porch of the overseer's cabin would look, to a man watching from that angle, like nothing at all. But it is not nothing. It is a hollow. It is a small, careful hollow cut into the wall of the pit at exactly the depth where the earth of the plantation stops being loose topsoil and starts being the harder, cooler, more compact clay of the subsoil. It is the kind of hollow that a woman with a lifetime of knowledge of Mississippi clay, knowledge she had learned from Aunt Zilpa in the years when the old woman had shown her which soils held water and which soils held roots, and which soils were the soils that country people, going back generations, had used for the small, private storage of things they did not want other people to find, would know how to cut. And into that hollow, over the course of 2 years and 4 months, in 122 Sunday morning digging sessions of 2 hours each, Cora Bell placed things. Small things. Careful things. Things she carried out to the clearing every Sunday morning, hidden in the seam of the plain gray dress that had been washed so many times it had become the color of the sky. She placed in the hollow, over those 2 years, 19 small silver coins, half-dimes and dimes mostly, a few quarters, 1 half-dollar. She had gathered them over 5 years from the tips she was quietly given by white travelers passing through the plantation who had come to her in the years after Aunt Zilpa's death for herbal treatments the Natchez doctors could not or would not provide. She had hidden them, one at a time, in a small crack in the wall of her own cabin behind the shelf with the letter C carved on it. A folded piece of paper given to her in the summer of 1847 by a free black waterman named Titus, who worked the small skiff that ferried supplies across the creek between the Fenwick place and the plantation next door, and who had, one afternoon in late August of that year, in a moment when no one was watching, pressed the paper into Cora Bell's hand and whispered 5 words. "When you are ready, come." The paper contained, in the careful hand of a northern abolitionist who had been passing through the parish 6 weeks earlier, the name and location of a station on the Underground Railroad, a small farm in southern Ohio, run by a Methodist family that could be reached from the Natchez country by a specific set of river passages that Titus had memorized. A small folded piece of homespun cloth containing a lock of hair. It was her mother's hair, cut from Judith's head by Aunt Zilpah on the day Judith was buried in the summer of 1828, and given to Cora Bell in the last year of Aunt Zilpah's life with the instruction, "Keep this child. It is all you have left of her, and one day you will want it." A small pouch of dried pennyroyal, and another of snake root, and another of the specific root of a plant Aunt Zilpah had called long root, a plant Cora Bell knew because Aunt Zilpah had told her could be brewed into a tea that, taken in a specific dose, would kill a grown man in his sleep in a way that the country doctors of Adams County in 1849 would identify as a sudden weakness of the heart, because the plant left no marks on the body, and no smell in the mouth, and no color in the stomach that a 19th century post-mortem examination in a rural Mississippi county would ever detect. And a small wooden object, carved by her father Isaac in the last year of his life. It was a small letter C, the same letter he had carved on the shelf above her bed, but this time not on a fixed piece of wood, but on a small round disc about the size of a large coin, with a hole bored through the top of it so that a piece of leather thong could be strung through it and it could be worn around the neck. Isaac had made it for her in the spring of 1828, 3 months before he died, and Cora Bell had worn it under her dress, against her skin, for all 21 years since. She placed all of these things in the hollow, and she covered the hollow at the end of every Sunday's digging with a small, careful facing of loose earth that she pressed into place with the flat of her palm. Earth that, from the porch of the overseer's cabin, at a distance of 22 paces, was completely indistinguishable from the rest of the pit wall. The pit, in short, was not a grave. The pit was a bank vault. The pit was, and this is the thing I want you to understand, this is the small, dark miracle at the center of this whole story. A piece of infrastructure Cora Bell was building for an escape she had already, on the 53rd Sunday of the ceremony in the winter of 1847, made the decision to attempt. She had understood in the 52nd Sunday, when William Fenwick had said, "Deeper next week," exactly what the ceremony was. She had understood that he was not going to shoot her. She had understood that he intended to make her come out to that clearing every Sunday morning for the rest of her natural life. And she had understood, in the same private movement of the same private mind, that if he intended to keep her alive and to keep her coming out to the clearing every Sunday morning, then he was, in effect, giving her a 2-hour window of the week, every single week, without fail, for the rest of her life, in which she was alone in a specific location with a shovel, and no one, not Bordelon, not the sub-overseers, not the other enslaved people, was permitted to interfere with what she was doing. He had, in the small, dark cruelty of his own scheme, given her exactly the conditions any escape planner in the world would have asked for. And she had, quietly, patiently, one Sunday at a time, used those conditions to build the thing she needed to build. I want you to hold on to the beauty of this, because the beauty of it is what makes it, in the end, one of the most extraordinary, quiet acts of resistance in the whole recorded history of American slavery. William Fenwick believed in his own private theater that he was breaking her. Cora Bell, on the other side of that theater, was, every single Sunday, in the exact same clearing, under the exact same shotgun, in front of the exact same man, assembling, item by careful item, the escape kit that was going to carry her out of the state of Mississippi. The 19 coins were her money. The folded paper was her map. The lock of hair and the wooden C with the pieces of her family she refused to leave behind. The pouches of pennyroyal and snake root were her medicine for the long walk north. And the long root, the small pouch of long root hidden in the deepest corner of the hollow, wrapped in a scrap of oilcloth she had taken from the candle house, was the thing that was going to make sure William Fenwick, on the morning she disappeared, did not send Jean Bordelon and a pack of hounds after her. Because the long root, brewed into the coffee that William Fenwick took every morning at 6 o'clock from the tray Miriam carried up to his study, was going to kill him in his chair before he could sound the alarm. That was the plan. And I want you to sit for one moment with what that plan required. It required Cora Bell to know, with certainty, at what stage of digging William Fenwick would consider the pit finished enough that he might stop bringing her out to it. Or, more importantly, at what stage the pit would be deep enough that the hollow she had cut in the wall could not, from the porch, be seen at all, and could therefore be safely finished. It required her to know the exact rotation of household servants in the main house, so that, on the morning of the plan, she would know which servant carried the tray to William Fenwick's study, and whether that servant could be spared from the aftermath. It required her to have a route out of the plantation that took her through country she did not know, on a river system she had never traveled, toward a Methodist farm in Ohio she had never seen, whose only reality in her mind was 5 words a waterman had whispered to her one afternoon in August of 1847. It required her, above all, to keep digging that grave every Sunday morning, without ever once, not in 122 consecutive Sundays, allowing William Fenwick to see on her face, in her posture, in the way she held the shovel, any hint of what was actually happening in the small, careful hollow at the west wall of the pit. She did it. All of it. Without a single Sunday of hesitation. By the spring of 1849, the Sunday morning I described to you at the very beginning of this story, when a woman in a dress the color of the sky was standing in a pit up to her thigh with steady hands on a shovel and a face that would not break. The hollow in the west wall of the pit contained every single item Cora Bell needed to walk out of the state of Mississippi and never come back. She was, on that Sunday morning, about 6 weeks away from the last morning she would ever spend on the Fenwick place. She did not know the exact date yet. She was still, on that Sunday morning in the spring of 1849, waiting for one specific condition to be met. She was waiting for the moon. Because the escape she was planning, the escape whose entire infrastructure was in the pit behind her, could only be attempted on a night with no moon at all. And in the spring of 1849, the next new moon was going to fall on the night of Sunday, the 22nd of April, the last Sunday of April, 6 weeks from the morning we started with. She stepped out of the pit that morning when William Fenwick cocked the shotgun at 9 o'clock. She laid the shovel down. She walked back through the pines to her cabin. She did not, on her face, in her posture, in the way she held the shovel, betray a single flicker of what was in her mind. And in the 6 weeks that followed, in the small, careful daylight of the plantation, she began, one small, careful piece at a time, to assemble the last things she needed. I want to be careful with you in this section about what I tell you and what I do not tell you, because Cora Bell, in the 53 years she lived after the night of the 22nd of April, 1849, was very careful herself about what she told and what she did not tell. She did not, in the whole of her remaining life, ever put down on paper, because she could not write, or ever have someone else put down on paper for her, the specific mechanics of what happened at the Fenwick place on that night. She would say to her granddaughter, 60 and 70 years later, in the small wooden house in Cass County, Michigan, one sentence about it, and only one. "I did what I had to do, child. The Lord and I have had our conversation about it. It is between the two of us now." But we know, from the accounts of the 2 other enslaved people who left the Fenwick place with her that night, and from the small, careful reconstruction that a Cass County historian named Sarah Reynolds put together in the 1970s from every fragment of evidence she could find, the general shape of what happened. It went like this. On Sunday morning, the 22nd of April, 1849, Cora Bell walked out to the clearing behind the smokehouse for the 123rd time. She dug for 2 hours. She did, and this is one of the small details Sarah Reynolds reconstructed from the physical evidence of the pit itself, which was, remarkably, still detectable in the ground in the 1970s when Reynolds did her fieldwork. One thing that morning that she had never done on any previous Sunday. In the last 20 minutes of the 2 hours, she cut into the east wall of the pit, the wall on the opposite side from the hollow where her supplies were hidden, a second, larger, more obvious hollow. She did it slowly, casually, the way an experienced worker cuts an unavoidable rock face out of the way. She did it in full view of William Fenwick on the porch. She did it because she wanted him to see it. She wanted him to be looking at the east wall of the pit that morning and not at the west wall. Because on that morning, in the last 5 minutes of the 2-hour session, she reached into the west wall hollow and she quietly, in a single, unbroken motion, transferred every item in it. The coins, the paper, the lock of hair, the wooden C, the pouches of herbs, the small pouch of long root, into the seam of the plain gray dress that had been washed so many times it was the color of the sky. And when William Fenwick, at 9 o'clock, cocked the shotgun with the small, dry click that had opened and closed the ceremony of 123 Sundays, Cora Bell stepped out of the pit for the last time. She laid the shovel down. She walked back through the pines to her cabin. She did not look back. That afternoon, the ordinary Sunday afternoon that always followed the Sunday morning of the pit, Cora Bell did 3 small, ordinary things. She washed her Sunday dress in a bucket in the yard behind her cabin, hung it on the line, and put on her weekday dress. She visited Delphia in Delphia cabin, and the 2 of them sat on the front step and did not say very much, because the 2 of them, together, over the previous 2 years and 4 months, had said everything they needed to say to each other about what was coming. And she went, in the last hour of daylight, to the small enslaved burying ground at the northeast corner of the property, and she stood for a long time in front of the two rough wooden markers, one for Judith and one for Isaac, that she had been visiting on Sunday evenings for 21 years. She did not weep. She did not speak. She stood in the failing light with her hands folded in front of her, and she said, in the small, private country inside her own skull, whatever the last thing was that a daughter says to two parents she is about to leave in the ground of a country she is never going to come back to. Then she walked back to her cabin, and she went to sleep, and she waited for the moon. The moon set that night at 7:14 in the evening. By 10 o'clock, the sky over the Fenwick place was as dark as a country sky in April of 1849 ever gets, which is very dark indeed, with only the small, hard points of the stars and, in the east, the faint suggestion of the Milky Way running from the tree line up over the roof of the main house. At 10:30, in the pantry off the main kitchen of the main house, the housekeeper, Miriam, the same Miriam who had, 2.5 years earlier, carried the small piece of gossip about Delphia and Cora Bell into the main house, and who had, in the interim, developed, in the private movement of her own conscience, a set of small, careful regrets about that decision, took down the tin of ground coffee that would be used in the morning for William Fenwick's 6 o'clock cup, and she opened it, and she stirred into the coffee grounds the small pouch of long root that Cora Bell had, earlier that evening, in a moment of quiet in the back kitchen when the two of them had passed each other in a doorway, pressed into her hand. Miriam did not say anything to Cora Bell in that doorway. Cora Bell did not say anything to Miriam. They had, in the small, careful language of two women who had spent 2.5 years watching each other and understanding each other, and slowly and painfully coming to the same conclusion about what had to happen, arranged the entire small piece of choreography without ever putting a word to it. Miriam knew what she had to do. Cora Bell knew what she had to do. And in the moment their hands touched in the doorway, and the small oilcloth-wrapped pouch passed from one hand to the other, the piece of the plan that could not have been done from the clearing behind the smokehouse was silently, invisibly, put into motion. At 11 o'clock, Cora Bell left her cabin. She did not carry a lantern. She did not need to. She had walked the specific route she was about to walk, from her cabin, down the lane between the quarters, across the pasture behind the smokehouse, past the clearing where the pit lay open under the stars, through the gap in the pines, and down the small farm track that ran west from the plantation toward the creek, hundreds of times in her life. She could have walked it in her sleep. She was walking it now, in the dark, in absolute silence, with everything she owned in the world sewn into the seam of her plain gray dress. She was not walking alone. Behind her, at intervals of about 20 paces, walked two other figures. The first was Delphia, 22 years old now, wife of Reuben, the same young woman who had come to Cora Bell in the rainy October of 1846 with the terrible whispered problem that had started all of this. Reuben was not with them. Reuben had made, in the private conversation the three of them had had in Delphia's cabin the previous week, the small, painful decision that his best contribution to the plan was to stay behind, to raise the alarm in the wrong direction in the morning, and to give the three of them the extra hours of head start that his own quiet performance of confusion could buy. He had made that decision, and Delphia had wept, and Cora Bell had held Delphia's hand, and it had been agreed. Delphia was walking behind Cora Bell now, in the same plain gray dress, with her own small bundle of things sewn into her own seam. The second figure, the one at the back of the small procession, was a young man of 19 named Ephraim. Ephraim was the son of Aunt Zilpah's oldest surviving grandchild, a woman named Hattie, who had died in the fever summer of 1841. He had been raised, since he was 2, in the small, careful shadow of the enslaved community's memory of his grandmother. He had come to Cora Belle in the fall of 1848, 6 months before the night I am describing, and had said to her, in the plain, honest voice of a boy who had thought about a thing for a very long time before saying it, "Auntie Cora, I have watched you. I know what you were doing on Sundays. Whatever it is, I want to help. And when the day comes, I want to walk out with you." Cora Belle had looked at him for a long moment. She had said, "Ephraim, what I am doing is going to get someone killed. Do you understand that?" Ephraim had said, "Yes, ma'am. I understand it. And I am still telling you what I told you." She had taken him into the plan. Now he was walking at the back of the small line, his eyes on the darker shadow of Delphia in front of him, his ears on the small, careful sounds of the night, the crickets, the far-off cry of a screech owl, the small, dry rustle of the pine needles overhead, listening for any sound of pursuit that was not yet coming, and would not, if Miriam's part of the plan worked, come in time. The 3 of them walked west along the farm track for a little over a mile. They came, in the second hour after midnight, to the creek that formed the western boundary of the Fenwick place, and on the far side of the creek, in a small skiff that had been pulled up onto the mud of the bank in exactly the place Cora Belle had been told, in a whispered conversation 2 Sundays earlier, to expect it, waited Titus, the free black waterman, with a lantern in the bottom of the skiff, its wick trimmed so low that from 10 paces away it was almost invisible. Titus did not speak. He held out his hand. Cora Belle handed him the folded piece of paper, the piece of paper he had given her in August of 1847 with the name of the Methodist farm in southern Ohio written on it. And she looked him in the face for a long moment in the small yellow light of the lantern, and she said, in a voice too quiet to carry 6 feet, "Thank you, Titus." He nodded once. He said only one thing back to her. "Go, Cora Belle, and do not turn back." She stepped into the skiff. Delphia followed. Ephraim followed. Titus pushed the skiff off the mud into the black water of the creek and turned it downstream toward the great brown coil of the Mississippi River, 3 miles to the south, where, in the pre-dawn hours of the morning, a different free black waterman in a different, larger boat was going to meet them and carry them north. At 6 o'clock in the morning of Monday, the 23rd of April, 1849, in the main house of the Fenwick place, William Fenwick sat down at his desk in his second-floor study, and Miriam brought him his tray with his coffee on it. He thanked her with a small, distracted nod. She left the room. She closed the door quietly behind her. At 6:14 in the morning, William Fenwick lifted the cup, drank the coffee, set the cup down, opened his Bible, read 3 verses of the book of Amos, and, in a manner of the country doctor from Natchez, arriving 4 hours later, would describe in his written report as a sudden and complete weakness of the heart, of the kind sometimes observed in men of Mr. Fenwick's age and habits, slumped forward in his chair, with his forehead resting on the open page of the Bible, and he did not move again. By the time the alarm about Cora Belle and Delphia and Ephraim was raised, because Reuben, playing his part exactly as he had promised, spent the first 3 hours of the morning searching the wrong parts of the plantation, and because the household was, in any case, entirely absorbed for the first 6 hours of the day in the sudden death of the master, the 3 of them were already 60 miles north on the Mississippi River, hidden in the false bottom of a cotton barge, on their way to Memphis. From Memphis they went to Cairo. From Cairo they went up the Ohio. From the Ohio they went overland to the Methodist farm in southern Ohio. From southern Ohio, over the next 14 months they went, in the slow, careful stages of the Underground Railroad in the late 1840s, north through Ohio and Indiana and Michigan, to the Detroit River, to the ferry, to the far side. They arrived in the small settlement of Chatham in the province of Canada West on the 11th of June, 1850. All three of them alive. Cora Belle was 32 years old. She had sewn into the seam of a plain gray dress that had been washed so many times it was the color of the sky, everything she still owned in the world. 19 silver coins, a lock of her mother's hair, and a small wooden letter C. And what she had left behind, in a clearing behind a smokehouse in Adams County, Mississippi, was an empty pit, 6 feet 3 inches deep, and a man in a chair with his forehead on an open Bible, and the small, dark ending of a discipline that had been designed in the private theater of a 48-year-old man's boredom to break her. It had not broken her. She had used it. She had used it in the small, careful, patient way that only a woman who had been taught the plants by an old woman in a swamp 50 years earlier could have used it, to walk out of the state of Mississippi and never come back. She did not stay in Canada. She stayed for 6 years, from the summer of 1850 to the fall of 1856, in the small black settlement of Chatham, working as a laundress, learning to read at the age of 34 in the small night school run out of the basement of the African Methodist Episcopal Chapel, saving every coin she could put her hands on toward a purpose she did not yet name to anyone. Delphia and Ephraim stayed with her for the first 2 years, and then, in the summer of 1852, Delphia went east to join a small settlement of formerly enslaved people near Toronto, where she remarried and lived out a long, ordinary life as a schoolteacher's wife. Ephraim went west to Windsor, where he took up the carpentry trade and, in 1861, joined a Union regiment recruited out of the border settlements and served, in the last year of the American Civil War, as a corporal in the 102nd United States Colored Troops. He came out of the war alive, and he came back to Chatham to see Cora Belle in the summer of 1866, and the two of them sat on the porch of her small rented house and did not say very much, because the two of them, together, had said everything they needed to say to each other on a Sunday afternoon in April of 1849, and everything else was just the shape of the long, good lives they had been given the chance to build. In the fall of 1856, Cora Belle moved to the United States. She moved because the state of Michigan in the 1850s had become, through the small, dense network of Quaker and Methodist and formerly enslaved settlers who had built its southern counties, one of the few places in the American North where a formerly enslaved black woman could, with sufficient care, live openly, buy land, and build a life. She moved specifically to Cass County, in the southwestern corner of the state, to the small settlement of Calvin Township, a place that had been, since the 1830s, one of the most important black settlements in the American North, home to more than 1,000 formerly enslaved people who had, over 3 decades, built farms and schools and churches on ground the local Quakers had helped them acquire. She bought, in the winter of 1856, 40 acres of farmland at the edge of Calvin Township from a Quaker farmer named Josiah Chandler, who sold it to her for $19 an acre, payable in installments over 10 years, at 0 interest, because that was the kind of arrangement the Quakers of Cass County were quietly known for making with the fugitives who came into their country. She married, in the spring of 1859, a man named Solomon Bell, a formerly enslaved carpenter from North Carolina who had come north on the Underground Railroad in 1849, and who had, in the 10 years between his arrival in Cass County and his meeting with Cora Belle, built himself into one of the most respected craftsmen in the township. She took his last name because, in the small, careful arithmetic of the world she had come into, a black woman with a legal husband and a legal last name was a black woman who could not so easily be sent back. From that spring forward, she was Cora Bell. It was the name she would carry for the remaining 60 years of her life. She and Solomon had 4 children, 3 sons and a daughter. The daughter, born in the fall of 1861, was named Judith Zilpah Bell, after Cora Bell's mother, and after the old woman who had taught her the plants in the swamp. All 4 of the children lived to adulthood. 3 of them lived into their 80s. The daughter, Judith Zilpah, lived to 1954, and it was her daughter, Cora Bell's granddaughter, a woman named Ruth Bell Coleman, who eventually gave the small, careful, reconstructed account of Cora Bell's story to the historian Sarah Reynolds in 1971. Cora Bell worked the farm with Solomon for 29 years. They grew corn and wheat, and in the small, careful garden behind the farmhouse, exactly the same medicinal plants Cora Bell had learned from Aunt Zilpah in the swamps of Adams County half a century before. She became, in the small black community of Cass County, exactly what her teacher had been in the small enslaved community of the Fenwick place. The person people came to when a child was fevered, when a wound had gone bad, when a woman was in a labor that had lasted too long, when the country doctor from the county seat could not or would not come. She delivered, over the 43 years she practiced her herbal midwifery in Cass County, more than 600 babies. She lost, in her own personal count that she kept in a small notebook Solomon had bound for her in leather in 1867, only 14 of them. She never charged a fee. If a family had money, they gave what they could. If they had no money, they gave a chicken, or a bushel of corn, or a promise. She kept on a small shelf in the parlor of the farmhouse, a shelf that Solomon had carved for her in the first year of their marriage, and on which, in careful chiseled letters, he had cut the single letter C, because she had told him, on the first night they spent together in the house, the story of what her father Isaac had carved on the shelf of the cabin she had been born in, a small metal box containing every letter of thanks she had ever received. There were, by the time she died in 1919, 371 letters in the box. Solomon died in 1885 of pneumonia at the age of 63. Cora Bell was 67. She lived in the farmhouse he had built for her for another 34 years. She grew old in that house. She grew old the way women in Cass County in the late 19th century grew old. In a rocking chair on the front porch in the summer, in a chair by the wood stove in the winter, with grandchildren running in and out of the kitchen door, and a small, careful garden of medicinal plants at the edge of the yard. She never left Michigan again. She never went south of the Ohio River in the whole of her adult life after 1850. She never, in the 70 years between the night on the creek in Adams County and the winter she died in Cass County, spoke the name William Fenwick out loud to any human being. She spoke in the last week of her life, in the small, careful voice of a woman who had been waiting a very long time for the right moment to say a thing, to her granddaughter, Ruth, who was 29 years old and sitting by her bed on a winter afternoon in January of 1919 while a storm moved across the Michigan farm country outside. She said to Ruth, "Child, I want you to write something down. I want you to write it down slowly, and I want you to write it in your own hand, and I want you to keep it in the leather box on the parlor shelf, and I do not want you to show it to anyone until after I am gone. Do you understand?" Ruth said she understood. Cora Bell then dictated, in a careful voice that took her the better part of 4 afternoons to complete, the full account of what had happened at the Fenwick place. From the rainy October night in 1846, when Delphia came to her cabin, to the last morning at the pit, to the coffee in Miriam's kitchen, to the skiff on the creek, to the arrival in Chatham in the summer of 1850. She told Ruth everything. She did not soften any of it. She did not, because she was 101 years old and had, over the previous 70 years, made her private peace with God about all of it, apologize for any of it. She told the story exactly the way it had happened. And at the end of the 4th afternoon, when Ruth had put the pen down and was looking at her grandmother in the small, dim light of the winter room, Cora Bell said one last sentence. She said, "That man made me dig my own grave every Sunday for 3 years, child. He thought I would be the one who fell into it. In the end, I walked around it, and he was the one who went in." She died 3 days later, on the 14th of January, 1919. She was 101 years old. She was buried in the small cemetery of the African Methodist Episcopal Church in Calvin Township, next to Solomon. Her stone reads, Cora Bell, 1818 to 1919. Wife, mother, healer. She walked around it. Ruth Bell Coleman kept the dictated account in the leather box on the parlor shelf, exactly as her grandmother had asked her to, for the next 52 years. She showed it in 1971 to a young historian named Sarah Reynolds, who had come to Cass County researching the medical practices of 19th century black midwives. Reynolds spent the next 4 years cross-checking every fact in the account against every surviving record she could find. The Adams County property records, the 1849 Trinity Episcopal Church death registry for William Fenwick, the shipping manifests of the Mississippi River packet boats for April and May of 1849, the settlement records of Chatham and Cass County, the pension file of Corporal Ephraim Taylor of the 102nd USCT, and she confirmed, to a degree of historical certainty that professional historians rarely reach on any story from the antebellum South, that every detail Cora Bell had dictated to her granddaughter in January of 1919 was true. Reynolds published her findings in 1975 in a small academic monograph titled One Grave a Week, The Cora Bell Testimony and the Underground Railroad in Cass County, Michigan. It is not a famous book. It has, at this moment, been checked out of the University of Michigan Library exactly 41 times since 1976. But it is there. It exists. And anyone who takes the trouble to write ahead and ask can read it. The pit itself, the shallow rectangular depression 6 feet 3 inches deep in a clearing behind the site of the old Fenwick smokehouse, was still detectable in the red Mississippi clay of Adams County as late as 1974, when Sarah Reynolds visited the site to do her fieldwork. It has since been plowed over, and the land is now a soybean field, and there is no marker on the ground where Cora Bell stood for 123 Sunday mornings, building the escape her master thought was a grave. But she stood there. She stood there in 1846 and 1847 and 1848 and 1849. She stood in a plain gray dress that had been washed the color of the sky. She stood with steady hands on a shovel and a face that would not break. And she outlived him. She outlived him by 70 years. She outlived the plantation. She outlived the county. She outlived the entire generation of white men in Adams County who had known his name. She outlived the American Civil War and the Emancipation Proclamation and Reconstruction and the rise of Jim Crow and the First World War. And by the time she died on a farm in southern Michigan in the winter of 1919, there was not one human being left on the earth outside of her own family and Delphia's and Ephraim's who remembered William Fenwick's face.
And now, because you have walked with her all this way, through a Sunday morning in a clearing behind a smokehouse, and a shovel in a shallow pit, and a small hollow in the west wall, I want to ask you to do one small thing for her before we part tonight. I want you to say her name out loud once before you close this video. Cora Bell. Because in 123 Sundays, the man who owned her did not, one time, say it. And 175 years later, the small, ordinary act of a voice saying her name out loud in a room somewhere on the other side of the world from Adams County, Mississippi, is the one small piece of justice that is still in our hands. And if this story has touched your heart tonight, if it has sat down inside you the way stories about small, quiet, unstoppable women sit down inside people and refused to get up, then I want to tell you one thing more. I have spent a great deal of time researching this story. I have spent a great deal of time writing it. I have spent a great deal of time trying to bring you, on this porch, on this quiet evening, into a clearing in Mississippi in 1849 with a woman who deserved, more than any of us, to have her name spoken. If you would like to support the small, careful work of keeping stories like this alive, if you would like to help me sit down with the next name in the dark and do the same thing for her, you can, by using the Super Thanks button just below this video. It is the small button that says, Thanks. Any amount you can give, $1, $5, $20, goes directly into the research, the writing, and the time it takes to make sure the next Cora Bell, whose name is waiting somewhere in a Mississippi archive or a Michigan farmhouse right now, gets told the way she should be told. If the pit and the shovel and the coffee cup and the small wooden letter C moved you, then a super thanks tonight is the exact way you can tell me so, and the exact way you can help me keep going. Say her name once more before you go. Cora Bell. Because she was born in a cabin in Adams County, Mississippi in the spring of 1818. Because she was made to dig her own grave one Sunday morning at a time for 123 consecutive Sundays by a man who thought he was breaking her. Because she used every single one of those Sundays to build, in the west wall of a shallow pit, the exact infrastructure she needed to walk out of the state of Mississippi and never come back. Because she died a free woman on a farm in southern Michigan in the winter of 1919 at the age of 101, with a small wooden letter C on a leather thong around her neck. The same letter C her father had carved for her 3 months before he died in the summer of 1828. Then share this video with someone you love, because someone you love needs to hear that a woman in a dress the color of the sky once stood in a pit in a clearing behind a smokehouse in Adams County, Mississippi, and did not break. And that the man on the porch who thought he was watching her die was, in fact, watching her build the exact thing that was going to save her life. And if you want to keep walking with me through these forgotten corners of history, The pits, half buried in soybean fields, the leather boxes on parlor shelves in Michigan farmhouses, the folded pieces of paper pressed into a woman's hand on a summer afternoon by a free black waterman on a creek in Mississippi. Then stay a while. Subscribe. Turn on the bell. There are so many more names waiting in the dark. We are not done speaking them.